Chapter 96, Daly's Guess. By the afternoon of the next day, Klein had fully recovered from any signs of exhaustion. He walked into the Blackthorn Security Company with steady footsteps. "Good morning, Klein. The weather is so cool and beautiful today. I'm looking forward to tonight's feast." Roseanne, who was wearing a light green dress, greeted him with a smile from behind the reception desk. Klein deliberately touched his stomach and said, "Miss Roseanne, you shouldn't be talking about that so early in the morning. I'm already sick of today's mission that has yet to arrive. I only hope for the evening to arrive sooner." "Me too," Roseanne chuckled. She looked to the left and right, then she beckoned for Klein to come closer. She lowered her voice and said, "I met Madame Daly earlier." "Spirit medium Madame Daly?" Klein asked in surprise. The most famous spirit medium from Awoke County had been living at Enmat Harbor all this time, and it wasn't a short distance from Tingen. "Yes," Roseanne gave a firm nod and said, "but she has already left. She is my ideal beyonder. If I were to become a spirit medium, I would leave Tingen and travel all around the world by myself. To Intis, to Fasak, to Fainapotter, to the southern continent, to the vast prairies, primitive forests, and snow-covered plains. Lady, be aware of the Nighthawk's rules." Klein shook his head in amusement. "Even Madame Daly has to apply and obtain permission to leave Enmat Harbor." "I know that, but you can't just remind me about it now and shatter my dreams," Roseanne said, peeved. "The truth is, I would never become a beyonder. It's too dangerous. I know when I'll die from sudden gunfire. From what I've seen, beyonders are basically people who turn themselves into monsters to fight against monsters. Archbishop Janice said that we are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness," Klein replied, sighing. The quote had left a deep impression on him. To fight against the abyss, we had to endure the corruption of the abyss. The two of them fell silent in unison. Roseanne was the first to break the silence as she pursed her lips towards the partition and said, "Captain wanted you to meet him when you arrived." "All right." With his hat and cane in hand, Klein passed through the partition and entered Dunn's office after knocking on the door. A middle-aged gentleman with deep and serene gray eyes and a high hairline put down his coffee cup and said with a smile, "Daly was here." "Can't say that I'm surprised. Roseanne had just informed me," Klein replied with a smile. Dunn didn't mind his humor, but sighed. Daly was just transferred to the Backland Diocese, which is the world's busiest and most crowded city. They have the highest population of beyonders and the most opportunities. She has a higher chance of becoming an archbishop or a senior deacon than me. "Why?" Klein asked curiously as he took a seat. Dunn thought for nearly 20 seconds before answering. "She has a unique talent. In mastering and exploiting sequence potions, I've mentioned the internal rule of the Nighthawks before. If you want to consume the next potion in the sequence, you'll have to wait 3 years and go through a strict examination to prevent any loss of control. But typically, 3 years is far from sufficient. I spent 3 years going from a sleepless to a midnight poet. It took me 9 years to go from a midnight poet to nightmare, a full 9 years. And to go from nightmare to sequence 6, I've already spent 3 years. I have no idea how many more years I need. When our bodies age and our energy starts to decline, even if we overcome the latent dangers, we shouldn't attempt advancing anymore. This is because the risk of losing control at that point is so high that no one is willing to risk it. As for Daly and I, we are different from most beyonders. After she became a corpse collector, she handed in a special application after only a year. She hoped to consume the follow-up potion immediately. What surprised everyone was that she actually passed through the stricter examination and obtained the Gravidigger potion. It only took her 1 more year to go from Gravidigger to Spirit Medium. This year will be her 5th year as a Beyonder. She is only 24 this year, young enough to have many opportunities ahead of her. On the surface, she's the most famous spirit medium in Awa County. But she truly is an actual spirit medium. Isn't that acting? Old Neil had apparently mentioned that Madame Daly had similar tendencies. Klein felt that he had grasped the key reason for Madame Daly's quick ascension through the ranks. Captain, you're young enough as well. You're only in your 30s. Klein comforted Dunn, but added in his heart, it's just that your memory isn't that great. Dunn drank a sip of his coffee. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. Why didn't you ask Madame Daly about her method of mastering and exploiting sequence potions? Klein purposely asked. Dunn put down his coffee cup and massaged his temples as he spoke. She told me to become a true nightmare. I don't know what that means. Play the role of a nightmare. Man, a nightmare sounds sinister. Klein creased his eyebrows and temporarily fell silent. Then, Dunn took out his smoking pipe and sniffed at it. Daly and I discussed the possibility of Seer's follow-up potion being Clown. Assuming that the member of the Seers didn't lie to you, she brought up an interesting hypothesis. What hypothesis? Klein asked hurriedly, his eyes turning bright. He had once used a divination method to determine if Clown was the follow-up potion of Seer. The answer he received had been vague, but it seemed close to being a confirmation. Dunn's deep and serene gray eyes swept his gaze at him, while he said in thought, a normal sequence pathway proceeds in a stepped manner. They advance according to a particular similarity. For instance, Sleepless, Midnight Poet, and Nightmare are all obviously related to the darkness of the night, as well as the peaceful sleep and tranquility that is generated from sleep. It can be imagined that every subsequent sequence would have identical traits, only with more power and a wider scope. They might be linked to secrets, disaster, horror, the crimson moon, etc. Certain sequence pathways appear unrelated, but when we analyze them in detail, we can still find similarities, such as assassin and instigator. Their implied similarity is to bring people calamities, pain, sorrow, and despair. Hence, the follow-up sequences should abide by this pattern. Klein paid close attention and asked proactively, but Seer and Clown doesn't have such a connection. Yeah, Dunn nodded and said, Daly believes that there might be sequence pathways that share another kind of relationship. After all, there's a lot we do not know. He paused for a moment before saying, Daly said that, in this sort of pathway, the low to mid sequence potions would respectively provide the Beyonder, an ability that seems brand new and unrelated to the others. When the Beyonder reaches a point of qualitative change, these abilities will mix into an abnormally powerful job that includes them all. In other words, the pathway doesn't advance step by step, but instead it's a relationship of dissection and combination. Klein listened intently, but he felt lost. Dunn lifted his right hand and said, a normal sequence pathway advances a bit at a time, just like a child growing up. A growing child becomes taller, stronger, heavier, and more mature from a young age, while special sequence pathways are more like. Having said this, Dunn lifted up his thumb. This is sequence 9. Then, he lifted up his index finger. This is sequence 8. Then, he gradually lifted up the rest of his fingers. Each and every finger is independent and doesn't seem to be related to the others. But in the end, when he said the word end, Dunn clenched his fingers into a tight fist. I understand now. Klein was suddenly enlightened. He agreed with Lady Daly's guess and the captain's metaphor. Maybe that's how it is. He nodded in deep thought. Sequence 8 Clown and Sequence 9 Seer are completely different and have brand new abilities. And according to the description from the Nighthawk's intelligence, the corresponding Sequence 7 and Sequence 8 Clown don't share any similarities either. Klein fell silent for a while before curiously pressing on. At which stage would the different abilities combine to form a qualitative change? Dunn took another sip of coffee and chuckled. Daly, and I guess sequence 4. Why'd Klein blurted out? Because according to the way the churches categorize sequences, sequence 4 is the beginning point of the higher sequences. It is said that merely achieving such a level brings about qualitative changes in vitality and energy. In ancient times, sequence 4 beyonders were qualified to be called demigods in the 4th epoch. It's a pity that such beyonders are very rare in this era, Dunn said wistfully. If sequence 4 to sequence 1 are high sequence beyonders, then who are the low sequence beyonders? Klein asked with interest. Sequences 9 through 7 were considered as low sequences 1,000 years ago. But in recent centuries, beyonders are few in number, and each church has listed sequence 7 as a mid-sequence. Dunn laughed in a self-deprecating manner. Sequence 9 and sequence 8 are low sequences. Then, sequences 7 through 5 are mid-sequences. Finally, those sequence 4 and above are high sequences, Klein repeated in his head and inevitably felt a yearning for that. Emperor Roselle was a high sequence beyonder. However, the higher the sequence, the greater the risk of losing control, Klein thought to himself in fear. He asked as though, in a seemingly casual manner, "What is the sequence for potion for the Church of the Goddess called?" In actual fact, I'm not sure. My security clearance isn't high enough for me to be privy to that information. I'll be able to read them when I become a diocese bishop or Nighthawk's deacon. Dunn shook his head and smiled. In fact, at least half of the church's 13 archbishops and 9 senior deacons at the top of the church's hierarchy are below sequence 4. That's just me being optimistic. The archbishop in Zangwil, who became wanted, lost control when he tried to advance to sequence 4. The one who stole sealed artifact 08. His potion was apparently called Gatekeeper, Klein thought, and probed. Is Sleepless sequence 5 Gatekeeper? No, that's in Spirit Medium's pathway. You'll be allowed to access that information when you reach sequence 7 and become a bishop or a captain of a Nighthawk's team. Gatekeeper is sequence 5 of the Spirit Medium pathway? Does it mean that it's keeping watch over the gates to hell? Or keeping watch over the gates to the spirit world? Klein guessed. All right, go to Old Neil and continue with your studies. Dunn smiled and said, don't forget about dinner tonight at Old Will's restaurant. Reservations have been made. I'll introduce you to the rest of the Nighthawks officially. All right, I've already prepared the money. Klein forced a smile. No, there's no need. Have you forgotten that we have additional bonuses? The part about you completing an assigned mission. Dunn waved. Klein was momentarily taken aback before replying with a beaming smile. All right, Captain. He turned around and walked towards the door, while counting inwardly, 3, 2, 1A. Why didn't Captain call me back? Klein dragged out one for a very long time, only to be surprised that Captain Dunsmith hadn't forgotten at anything. A miracle. In the armory, Old Neil stole a glance at Klein, who was in a good mood. Don't be obsessed with tonight's dinner. You still have a lot of things to learn, such as more ritualistic magic, ancient Hermes, Dragonish, Elvish, and many more. Yeah, every afternoon besides your day off, you have to have at least 2 hours of combat training with an instructor. Combat training? Captain didn't mention it. Klein was shocked. Old Neil nodded and didn't hesitate to answer. He forgot.